This webinar is organized by SAPER, which is an acronym that stands for Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. It's part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, is one of the principal arms of that mechanism. The other one is the group of chief scientific advisors to the Commission. And things are divided up in such a way that SAPER produces evidence review reports, and on the basis of those, the group of chief scientific advisors writes a scientific opinion, which then is the actual policy advice to the European Commission. And today we are very fortunate to have one of the chief scientific advisors with us, namely Karina Keskitalo. So SAPER is made up of 5 pan-European organizations, and they are here on the screen right now. This is Academia Europaea. It is the Federation of European Academies of Medicine. It is the European Academies Science Advisory Council. It is the Federation of European Engineers, Eurocase, and it is all European academies. SAPER has actually dealt with food previously, and in fact the very first evidence review report, which was published at the end of 2017, dealt with food, and the topic was food from the oceans. And the questions that have been given to us by the Commission was, how can we extract more food from the oceans in a sustainable manner? And this gave rise to this evidence review report that you see at the left of the screen. The group of chief scientific advisors produced a scientific opinion. And in the top right corner here, you can see Karina Keskitalo at the hand over of the report to the Commissioner. Now, more recently, SAPER has again produced a report dealing with food, and this is a report that was published earlier this year called A Sustainable Food System for the European Union, and the lead academy for this was ALEA. And we are lucky today to have with us one of the members of the working group that produced this document, namely Catherine Termeer, who will speak later on in this program. As part of that project on a sustainable food system, we also undertook a systematic review of the European policy ecosystem, and that part of the project was led by Academia Europaea. And we are lucky today to have with us Terry Marston, who chaired the advisory panel that oversaw the production of that systematic review. The report on sustainable food systems made a number of points, and I don't have the time to go into this in great detail at this point, and many of these points will undoubtedly come up during this webinar. But first of all, it's very clear that the global demand for food will increase. I already referred to the fact that many people are actually going hungry at the moment. It's clear that there will be a need for change of behavior. There's also the problem that food systems do contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. And obviously the report also deals with how could one change behavior. And in fact, the evidence report points out that one of the most effective ways to modify behavior is actually via taxation. And we may also hear more about it later on. There is obviously a need for reform of European agriculture and fisheries policies, but that would offer great opportunities to develop resilience and sustainability. We have with us today a very distinguished panel of speakers, and they will, each of them, give presentations, and the order will be that the first presentation will be given by Tim Lang, who is Professor of Food Policy at the City University of London. That will be followed by a presentation by Terry Marston, who, as I already mentioned, was involved in the sustainable food systems systematic review part of the process. Is at Cardiff University. And then we shall have a presentation by Catherine Termeer, who is Professor and Chair of Public Administration and Policy Group at the Wageningen University. And we will end up with Karina Keskitalo, one of the Chief Scientific Advisors to the European Commission, who is Professor at Umeå University in Sweden. And so, without any further ado, I will now give the floor to Tim Lang, and I will stop sharing my screen and ask Tim to share his screen.
Now. Okay, thank you very much for that, Ole, and I too say good wishes on World Food Day. But remember, I come from Brexit land, which is kind of forgotten the issue of food and think somehow it comes from the air when in fact 40% comes from the EU to Britain. But anyway, we are where we are, as we always say in food policy. I have to say this, we know the evidence is very good about a bad situation. The food system is in trouble. We have developed a food system in the last 75 years, which has now turned victory into crisis. Ecosystems are stressed. The food economy is not paying its full costs. Primary producers don't get the full money that goes elsewhere. We have a new phenomenon of food processing, which is now distorting health. There's too much food. We have a coincidence of hunger and malconsumption and over malconsumption. This is new in history. We have a cultural problem, which is that it's not just a crisis of production or distribution, but culture, the mind, consciousness. We eat ad libitum. We eat what we like, when it's coming from anywhere we like and how we like. And that's the we of the rich world, the European world. Even though within Europe there is poverty, there are inequalities. But that culture, as I've put here, I think is more and more our problem, and we're not talking enough about it. And we have food as a major societal problem. Inequalities between and within countries, even within Europe, but across the world, definitely. And it's showing in major life expectancy gaps. This is not a good situation to be 75 years from when the FAO was founded. It's in trouble. On the masters that we run at City University in London, we sometimes do, or I sometimes do, an exercise called 3 minutes with the minister. We academics can drown in complexity. We can say, give me more money, I need to do 10 years research work, I need to do this, I need to do that, we need better evidence. My view is completely reverse. We have enough evidence. And if we do the exercise 3 minutes with the minister, if you have, and I have done this, 1 minute with a president or 3 minutes with a minister, here are my 4 things. And I'll do it in less than 3 minutes. The first is we have to recognize this problem. There is a mismatch of human and ecosystems health. It's what I've called here the philosophical shift. And we have to do a transition to ecological public health, or what the veterinarians call One Health. The graph on the top is from my book with Jeff Rayner called Ecological Public Health. We have made cattle into our competitors. Secondly, we have to tackle the runaway nutrition transition. As countries get richer, as populations get richer in history, in the 20th century, and still today, they shift from eating not enough food to eating more food, getting a bigger range of foods, to then becoming something totally new, eating a distorted food. And ultra processing is the notion which now captures that. The notion developed and researched by the great Brazilian epidemiologist Carlos Monteiro and colleagues. But this is a cultural problem. If we look hard at the data, the World Health Organization's budget for public health is less than the marketing budget for a year of Coca-Cola alone. The World Health Organization has less money than one company to shape culture, to do something about the nutrition transition. We have to reverse that. There's no good saying, well, educate consumers. We've got to reverse it. That needs many things. Thirdly, We must, and I know Terry Marston, my friend, and I believe this very important lesson from the evidence. We must reconnect the urban and the rural. Sometimes food goes all over the world. Actually, only 10% is traded beyond countries, beyond regions. But nonetheless, supply routes are getting longer and more complex. This is a very important issue in political economy of food. And the critical thing, many of us working in this now think we have to get more money to the direct primary producers. When you look in my country, the 5th richest economy on the planet, actually what farmers and fishing people get is 4 or 5% of the gross value added. It's nothing. The money is made off the land. How can we get more money to primary producers to then do the right thing for ecological public health? The fourth thing is we've got to rethink land use. And the critical issue in that is priority to horticulture. For too long, the FAO, the UN, agronomists have gone along with the view that help poor farmers by going into animal production. We know that has got to be reversed. The priority is horticulture, actually. And to conclude, this transition to human health, linking to ecosystems health, requires other transitions. Society has to change, the economy, the politics has to change, culture change, and the values, the philosophy have to change. So this is a big picture that I think comes out of the evidence. In different countries, we need to do different things, but that big picture, the evidence is very, very strong for. And as one person said to me recently, this is such an enormous agenda. No wonder the politicians find it very difficult. We have to help the politicians make this transition.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, for this. And we will have all questions at the end, as I said in my introduction. So we will now move on immediately to Professor Terry Marston. So Terry, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk on this significant day. I'll follow on, I think, somewhat seamlessly from my colleague Tim Lang and talk on a European level, not just a British level. I think it's really very timely. The SAPIA-SAM reports, I think, synthesize a growing scientific consensus, which in fact, since those reports, almost immediately afterwards, the farm to fork strategy that the EU have actually published start to define the new consensus, I think, around European food policy, which now sort of exists and which Tim identified. Question is, what's stopping its implementation? And that's what I want to focus on with 4 or 5 points. They're perhaps a bit pragmatic, but I think they are very relevant to this process. I think we're into a process here, by the way, and I think it is interesting to see it historically, that we're into a new period of sustainable modernization in Europe, which is equivalent, but very different. It's equivalent in its profundity to the post-war agricultural paradigm that existed across Europe and in many parts of the advanced world from 1945, 1947 onwards, but also the more recent, the Mansholt modernization paradigm, which was so significant in agricultural productivism and economies of scale that existed in Europe from the 50s onwards. This is a very different era today, but we need, I think, a profound, significant transformative process, which the farm to fork strategy, I think, in Europe starts to identify. Now, I want to pick up on 4 or 5 points which are very relevant to that, which I think are really about how, the how question, not what, but how do we get from making a new transformative paradigm in sustainable food and farming in Europe, and indeed more generally across the world? And how does the EU and European communities become still a leading player in that process? For me, I think this is about repeopling and renaturing society. I think it's somewhat ironic that whilst on the one hand we're becoming more and more urban and cosmopolitan, at the same time we're going to have to rethink the significance and centrality of rurality and indeed of food metabolisms and systems. And I think the EU Green New Deal is the great opportunity. I say it's an opportunity because we're going to have to see how it unfolds. Let me make 3 or 4 points about what are some of the building blocks here. And I'm going to concentrate here very much on policy innovations that I think are relevant at European level. The first, it seems to me, is that, and it comes out of the SAM reports, and it also comes out of the food and farming reports of the EU recently, we need a new combination of innovative state-led incentives, financial, fiscal, taxation, regulation, stick carrots, which secondly rebalance the costs and benefits of food markets. For too long, we've been subsidizing a cheap food regime, which has been producing affordable food, but of a very poor quality, which has led to the problems of food, health, and diet. We need to reverse and recalibrate the incentives for producing higher quality foods for affordable populations and change the market mechanisms. We have great examples of doing that in Europe when we fixed prices and intervention prices back in the 1950s. And we need to be bold about how we can incentivize producers, processors, retailers, and consumers for buying and creating sustainable markets and supply systems. So we need to move from a cheap food policy to a high food quality policy, which is affordable, and recalibrate through intervention mechanisms and market mechanisms in order to do that. That's a big ask, but I think we need to be bold enough to try to do it. Secondly, there is ongoing, of course, the reform of the CAP in Europe, and that is a great opportunity, as the Food to Fork strategy suggests, of fostering family farming, diversity, multifunctionality of farming production, and reversing, again, the economies of scale logic that has been built in continuously in the CAP up until today, which has in fact led during the 2000s to a quarter of family farms disappearing in Europe. So despite the fact that the rhetoric is to protect and maintain family farming, we've been losing them at a great rate of knots, and we can't afford to lose family farming as SMEs and as bedrocks to sustainable farming in the future. You know, it'll be somewhat ironic if we look around just when we need more and more family farmers to find that we've lost 3/4 of them. So that's the critical issue, that we need a farming policy which is explicitly supporting family production at small scale, as well as at different diverse practices. Thirdly, this also involves what I call the infrastructure question, and that is we need to invest and stimulate in physical and digital infrastructures which rebuild localized and short-circuit chains in farmer-consumer linkages. That's not to deny the significance of long food mile, long just-in-time systems, but it is to re-diversify and support a much more diversified and regionalized food supply chain and circuits. There's a lot of very good examples, 20 years of research on this in Europe, not least from places like the Drôme Valley in southeast France and Ardèche, where you see clusters of territorial food systems re-emerging around agroecology and green procurement processes. What we need from policy, in European policy, is to stimulate this diverse process. So unlike Mansholt, which was very much a one golf club approach to economies of scale and reorganizing farming on economies of scale, we need almost a reverse. We need innovation which is creating spatial diversity and spatially place-based systems of embedded farming and supply chain systems. That's not to be romantic about localized systems at all. It's actually to say this is part of a sustainable future and repeopling the agri-food system. Let me finish with a caution about the farm to fork strategy in Europe. 3 points. One is it does start to indicate the abolition and regulatory, the stick, if you like, to reduce pesticide applications, to reduce antimicrobials, and to reduce phosphate applications. That is good. That's very good. But I'm not sure it goes far enough or it will have enough teeth. Secondly, as I've already said, we need a reformed CAP, and this is the time to do it, which can actually deliver what we call the circular bio-based economy for agriculture and food. And the third point, I think, is a caution that as I sit here in Wales and in the UK, I see, whilst a consensus around this scientifically and in many policy circles, divergent governance systems around the world, which are in fact pulling distinctions away from creating these integrated solutions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Terry. And we now move on immediately to Catherine Tamir. So Catherine, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this opportunity. And thinking about this webinar, I thought I can summarize our whole SAPIA report, but you can all read it, so I'm not going to do that. But I want to mention one of the important elements, and I think it also fits in the previous, the talks of the previous speakers, and that is that we all talk about transformative change. There are all those troubles. We have a health crisis, a societal crisis, an environmental crisis, an economic crisis. The food system is in trouble. But I think that to a certain extent, we also agree about the dot on the horizon. It must be circular, more sustainable, inclusive, diverse, etc. But talking about transformative change is easy, but how to get it organized? And therefore, I think it's good to present the so-called paradox of transformative change. Because talking about transformative change, we have three ambitions. First, we want to see a more in-depth change, because more of the same will not help us. So we need a new way of thinking, new cultures, new structures, new institutions, new policy systems, etc. So really in-depth change. But we also say that it must be fast, because the system is in trouble and all the problems are very urgent. And we also say, yes, but we don't want small changes only. It must be large scale at the system level, system change. And for example, if I have my 3 minutes with the minister, she also says, I want to go faster within my term in the office. But the paradox means that you can't do the three things at the same time, because there are all kinds of trade-offs. If you go for fast change, it will not be in depth, etc. So therefore, we developed the so-called small wins approach, which means that we start with small but in-depth changes. And I don't have time to explain it all, but the small wins approach means that you deal with societal problems through small but important steps who make sense to people and who have visible results. So it's not, small wins are not about paper promises, but visible results for people in the field. And those small wins can accumulate in more transformative change. Now, why is this helpful to deal with the paradox? Now, the first is that if you go for small wins, so small in-depth changes, you can do it more in-depth because people get less overwhelmed by the enormous challenges, because that can paralyze them, and then then it results in all kinds of wordy policy papers, but they don't go to the point any longer. So it can be more in depth and also more tailored and with more specified diagnosis. And the second is then the ministers say, okay, but I don't have time for all those small changes. But then we can also argue that in the end, transformative change through small wins will be faster, because those small wins are under the radar. So they have less political risks and less competition about success. That's also very important in political, in politics. But also it allows you to start earlier, because you can start with incomplete information, etc. Or to use a metaphor, if you want to go from the first floor of a building to the 10th floor, you can try to spring, but it's faster if you take the stairs step by step. Now, the third one, okay, but those small wins, it must be at a system level. Transformative change also means systematic system change. And then the argument is, okay, but those small wins, in complex systems like our food systems, they can accumulate through all kinds of non-linear mechanisms. And you see in the picture the thing that how it can be done. So you have an ambition, a circular inclusive system. You start looking what's already happening. Then you try to accelerate those small wins. And we have analyzed all kinds of mechanisms to do so. And then in the end, it's then you can arrive at that transformative change. But now back to the current system and the current period, because there are many crises, but the focus at the moment is of COVID-19. And how is COVID-19 then related to this story about small wins and transforming food system? And that's my optimistic view on it, that at this moment you can observe many small wins within the food system. You can see some pictures of that. For example, you see an emphasis or an increase of all kinds of community farming systems, on short relations between producers and consumers. You can also see that the harvesting is organized differently. For example, that people who are at this moment unemployed because they work in the restaurants, they help with harvesting, creating all kinds of new things. And I can mention many of these examples. So you can see that the crisis triggers many of these small wins. But then back to my 3 ministers with the minister, because I had them, then I can say, okay, minister, you know what you are aiming for, that circular, inclusive agriculture. And now start with looking what's already happening and what can be used to realize your ambition. And that means that the policy incentives, and that can be taxes, sugar taxes, or it can be everything, but target those incentives so that you can upscale, broaden, and deepen the small wins that are already there. And then you can also use all kinds of social, psychological mechanisms, like energizing, like the logic of attraction, etc. And of course, you can still use policy interventions we already know, but this vision also helps to, and that was also in my talk with the minister, to say, okay, and you must stop with those regulations. So stop with not collaborating within the government, because that hinders those initiatives, but also stop with changing the policy on a yearly basis, because that also hinders those initiatives. So to summarize, I think talking about transformative change, start with small wins because they are concrete and in depth and make use of it. And the current COVID time triggers a lot of things that happen. So I would say thank you, and I thought this was a nice picture about COVID and the food system.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this nice presentation. And we now move on immediately to Karina Keskitalo, one of the Chief Scientific Advisors to the European Commission. Karina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and hopefully you can hear me all right.
Yes, it's fine.
Excellent. So thank you so much, Ola, for your introduction. And thanks, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today, as others have said, on this special day. So what I will talk about very briefly is the opinion that was released this year with advice on for EU policy making on foods, which has already had some effect, as we heard earlier. And this was, of course, informed by the SAPEA research report that you heard about. I've also received links to both reports, both the scientific SAPEA report and our opinion as a basis for advice to policymakers in the chat, I think, and also in applying for this session, or registering for this session. So what people haven't mentioned so much so far, I think, is that this is actually somewhat different from existing advice on sustainable foods or food policy, and it's actually based on social science. And what it does in that, I think, is, I mean, natural science often highlights what is wrong in the natural system. What social science can do, I think, is actually highlight how to deal with it. What are the policy mechanisms? What are the behavioral targets that can be sort of drawn upon, or behavioral mechanisms that can be drawn upon? So I will talk a little bit about that finally. Okay, so to that end, I've chosen to emphasize the parts of the report or our opinion that really add to existing advice. And these are not the exact phrasings from the recommendations. You can see the exact phrasings and the exact way in which this is described in the opinion. But I've tried to sort of draw out in particular what can a social science approach provide in this span of 5 minutes. So what the opinion mainly does is highlight the need for making environmental, social, and economic sustainability the central objective of all policies relevant to food. So a really integrated approach. This actually then has to be done in ways that we start changing how we think about food, not only or mainly as a commodity, because how we see things has policy consequences. If you regulate something only as a commodity and think about it only as a commodity, then it's likely that you miss out other aspects, such as food as a human right or common good or so on. So this is a first way, really think about how do we actually regulate, what are the assumptions in our systems, and then to really think what works. And we already know that changing people's behavior is not an easy thing. Some things will work in some systems or cultures and not in others. And for that reason, it's really important to look at existing initiatives. For instance, local pilots, as it says here, are really seeing what could potentially be spread, what can't, but can maybe be upscaled. I really see what works in specific cultures, or as it says here, also choice architectures. And on that point then, addressing asymmetries and choice architectures in the food system. On the asymmetry part, we've often regulated the producers and the consumers, but not the parts in between. And this given, for instance, that retail chains and networks are often dominated by quite few and quite large players. There's quite a chance to address the asymmetry there and think, what can you regulate? And then also in that same way, then avoid placing responsibility on consumers, because much policy advice today seems to be targeted on that if we just provide the right information, then people will change. And social and behavioral research shows that this is just not the case. I mean, even if you know that a pizza isn't the best thing for you, you might go out tonight and buy one instead of a healthy salad. You know, you act within a choice architecture, or what is a culturally acceptable or desirable meal, what is nice to eat with friends, you know, all these things. And for that reason, instead, it might be about making healthy foods cheaper and easier to access. I mean, if I go and buy this pizza, maybe I go to the frozen pizza aisle, I'm in a rush, and closer there I see a salad which is cheap. I mean, in Sweden, you often eat kale salads with pizza for some cultural reason. Then you might just grab that too. So it's a lot about maybe getting retail to work potentially in a different way, avoiding placing all responsibility on consumers and avoiding assuming that information at its own makes for change. And for that reason, a focus has also been on some of the things people have mentioned already, to utilize a complete policy mix. Since we know that people don't change based on information only, we also have to realize that policy actors, producers, consumers, and the like also don't change based on information only or voluntarily. And there's plenty of research supporting this. So this means that voluntary means only go so far and it be supplemented with or be supplementary to other policy instruments. And we will also talk a bit more about this. Next week, this is the first in a series of SAPEA seminars, so we will also talk about the EU policy and what it can potentially do on October 22nd. Yeah, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karina. You almost surprised me by being very concise and very short. So thank you to all our speakers for these very nice presentations and a number of questions. Let me start with a kind of general question that has come up in different forms, and also add a little bit of my own perspective here. Many of you have talked about that we need fast changes, that we are already in a difficult situation and we need to change things very quickly. We hear that also, of course, in the context of climate change. But with climate change, we actually have a certain time frame that has been clearly pronounced by those people who advise on these matters. In this case of food systems, we hear that it should be fast, but we haven't got, I think, the same notion of what does fast actually mean. So I would like actually to hear from all of you, because it seems to me that that is an important point. Are we missing a chance by not having a precise timetable, or is it simply not possible to suggest a challenging time that would actually activate the system? And maybe we'll go through the panel very quickly about this, because it strikes me that this is an important point. So let's start with Tim and then go through the panel. Tim, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fast. I was the policy director or the policy lead on the EAT-Lancet Commission report that some of you may have heard of. We set our goal around the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, of 2050. So we look 30 years ahead. I personally think that's too slow. But that's within the existing policy architecture. So if we want to think in that way, at least within 2050, by 2050, so 29 years now. I think it's much better to be talking of 2030, because if we're not beginning the change, dramatic change that I think all of us agree is needed and that the evidence says is needed, we won't get any significant systemic change, even if we've taken the short steps that Katrine was arguing for. We won't get that unless we have begun a really significant scale of change by 2030. So for me, certainly in my country, not now part of the EU, I think the 2030 target is very good. It concentrates minds. And I'm a social scientist. I'm interested in getting the decision makers and encouraging the population to change, when at the moment everything encourages them not to do it. We have to shift that, and that has to be very quick indeed. So even if we take 2030, we have to begin that much faster. And in Brexit land, we are now having a new architecture, and in a sense, that is our opportunity.
Terry?
Yes, I think the climate change debates are absolutely central here, and I I agree. 10 years, 2030 is a critical time frame in order to do a lot of this. It's good to see that the farm to fork strategy in its annex is actually making those points and putting a lot in pinning changes during the early part of the 2020s. So there's an opportunity to make some rapid changes during that period. I don't think we can't push the can down the road further on this. I think it's really necessary. If you look where we've got to over the last 20 years, it's pretty appalling. If you look at the reform of the CAP over 30 years, it's pretty appalling. So we've really got to speed up. I take the view about small wins, of course, but you've got to have a vision as where to go. And I think it's really important we set targets. Target setting for politicians to deliver on these sorts of issues, not just on climate change, but on biodiversity restoration and on ecologically diets, I think is absolutely critical. So we need a multiple set of targets set within obviously the spatial contexts that exist, not just national level, but at regional level.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yes, now I try to argue that fast change is not possible, but that doesn't mean that I think we need to change and we need to have our targets. Of course, we need to have our targets in 2030 or 2050, but I also think that we already have those targets. Huh? So that's also my advice to policymakers. Don't pay too much attention to setting and discussing all those targets, because in the end we know where to go. And then it's next question, okay, but how to arrive at that situation? And probably there's some misunderstanding about my concept of small wins, because it are really in-depth wins, and probably I have to mention some examples. For example, the first farmer who experimented with vegan meat, and nowadays his firm is part of Unilever. But also the first circular farm, we already have them. But also the first fair trade label. It was a very small thing, but it accelerated, and now we have many of those labels. Also the first food bank, that were also people who really crossed a lot of barriers. And now, yeah, if we like it or not, we have many of them across the world. And also sometimes a law could be a small winner, for example, a sugar tax. So you see also that it accumulates across Europe. Or the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, you also see that it incentivizes the Dutch government to do the same things. So the small wins are really in-depth steps, but people always say, but that's only peanuts. It's only a label, or the Slavery Act is only about one small piece, it's only about transparency, it's not enough. But I think, okay, it's not enough, but let's start with that. And then the comment of Tim, that he said, okay, but there are many incentives that encourage people not to change. And that's always depends on the way you observe the world around you. And I try to observe it in a more appreciative way. And then you see a lot of people who change, and you see a lot of initiatives. So try to make use of that energy to arrive at your targets of 2030.
Okay, thank you. Karina?
Okay, a short comment. I'm not sure if you can see me or hear me.
Yes, we can.
Excellent, thank you. No, and I will answer this not as a member of the group of chief scientific advisors, because we actually don't have this per se in our opinion, but just as a personal reflection as a political scientist. I mean, looking at, for instance, historical institutionalism literature, I tend to think that, you know, what we can do at each point is what is interesting. We need to look at where we are now, what are the institutions we have now, what are they set as in what you can do now. So at each point in time, you have to think, what can you change at this point? And then sort of change as much as is possible, since we do know what the direction is in which we need to go. And this might then open up and make more things possible to change in a second step. I think that would be my main comment. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. A lot of questions about farmland being rezoned for housing and what to do about that. I'm not sure who would particularly want to comment on that, but maybe let's start with Karina.
Okay, now I missed that one, so you have to repeat it. I was looking through the questions that have been posed to me on the questions and answers session.
Yeah, people point out that a lot of farmland is currently being rezoned for housing, and that seems to be a problem. So what could or should be done about that?
But that's also a really difficult question. So I saw some really, really difficult questions here. I also received one about, how to limit the use of pesticides. Some of these, and this is also just a reflection, like a personal sort of reflection, rather than one on behalf of the entire group of chief scientific advisors. Some of these questions range across so many policy areas, and then you would need probably a better integration than what you have presently in different governments, and you would also need to maybe couple it with a reframing of, for instance, food security in each individual country. And maybe actually in that way, this awful COVID crisis may be positive because it may have made us think about some other of these issues. We need farmland that is not rezoned. We need to think about sustainable farming in our own country. We can't maybe even be dependent on produce or products even from elsewhere. Even to farm in our own country. So hopefully we will get some change, but these are extremely difficult questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And a question maybe to Tim. You mentioned the importance of high quality food, which still should be affordable for many people. And somebody asked, well, how to do that?
Actually, I think it was Terry who did that, but
okay, sorry. But anyway, we can ask Terry also.
We should ask Terry, but I work on that too. The issue of quality is partly what my short talk was putting under culture. Quality is not just a matter of microbiological contamination or even appearance, but it is about the meaning of a food or a diet or a dish to the consumer. So quality is a very plastic notion. It's malleable. It means different things to different people. Science has been very good on some of the scientific metrics for quality, but has very often completely missed the cultural dimension, which frames all of it. This has been a really critical issue in European policy. For 40 years, I speak as someone who spent 20 years inside the EU and working on the single market and trying to get the single market. And the notion of quality was pushed to one side to be a cosmetic, an appearance issue, plus microbiological safety. I don't think we even got that right, frankly. Now, when we know that quality is not just about appearance, but is about accepting that a carrot may not just be straight, a dish may taste different to different people according to the taste assumptions they have, quality becomes a very, very significant issue. So it's a good question, but it's very hard for policymakers to resolve.
To me, as a medical person, it also seems to be related a little bit to the very different lifespan that we have in different communities. I mean, in the UK, as you pointed out, a very rich country, we have people who live very short lives and people who live very long lives, and it undoubtedly has something to do with what they consume.
Yeah, well, and that's why in my talk I pushed the notion that somehow in Europe we've done very well to increase the range and standards of food, but we've now gone into a different zone, the ultra-processed notion that two people have asked about in the chat, is partly trying to capture that. I think it's a very important area. We need to be thinking. I can go into a supermarket or a shop anywhere in Europe and see a frozen pizza. It bears not much relation to the pizzas I used to eat when I lived in Rome as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, or 20. It's from a factory, it's a commodity, it's taste enhancers. The list of ingredients is about 20 or 30 ingredients. You know, quality actually, to some extent, is betrayed by the ingredients list. But you're right, Ole, it becomes a public health issue. I'm a social scientist, but I work on public health. The gap between rich and poor is partly about us not getting the quality issue right.
Well, we are running a little bit late now, so just a quick number of different questions. One person asks, can chefs play a role in the circular economy? Catherine, would you like to take that question?
I didn't understand the question. Can who play a role in the circular economy?
Chefs, the people who produce the food in
Oh, yes.
restaurants.
Yes, of course.
And how? And how? How would they do that?
Now, I think that's also to make a link, to link it with Tim's explanation. When you talk about the quality of food and natural ingredients, then it's very abstract language. But you can also encourage change to show examples. So to show that what I call the logic of attraction. And chiefs can play an important role in that. From your country, only know Jamie Oliver, of course. But for example, in the Netherlands, we are experimenting with, how do you call it, crops that grow very near the sea, so are very so salty food crops. And people think, oh no, I dislike it. But now we have chiefs who at the local level with pop-up restaurants develop tasty products, and that's much more influential than talking from an abstract level. We need to eat that and we need to appreciate quality, and of course we need those analyses, but to really influence and to really organize that people can make sense to it, that then show the examples, and chiefs are very important in that. But also beware that sometimes, and that's again with my small win, that it's still about in-depth learning, because at the moment chiefs know that they are that they have become influencers. So it could also be a superficial market model for them, business model. So not all chiefs can play these roles.
Thank you. The number of people in one way or another refer to the problem that, and this is a very general one, but we still may want to say a few words about it, that this GDP growth philosophy that obviously prevails in the whole of the Western world is a fundamental problem also for solving the food problem. Some people refer to the cancer stage of capitalism that makes it. So degrowth, how do we move into the field of degrowth is what some people ask. Maybe Terry could take that on.
Well, yes, thank you, Ollie. That's a big question at the end of the meeting. Yeah, I mean, I think we need multiple ways of rethinking growth and development, and multiple pathways of growth and development, not carbon-based development. We need to unhook ourselves from that process. I think, nevertheless, we need to be thinking about new ways of livelihood sustainability, how we're going to maintain our lives. COVID has demonstrated this, how farmers are going to survive, how landholders are going to survive. So I understand. I think what the degrowth debate, I think, does indicate is we need to unhook ourselves from one paradigm of gross domestic product and look at the creation of value and quality in a much more encompassing way in terms of food. I would just make one point here, that one of the issues that we're dealing with here, if food wasn't complicated and complex enough, is that it's not just about food, actually. It's about nature and management of nature, including the relationships between energy, soils, and the nexus of relationships here. And this is why land use and biosphere rights become so critical to this, because they're going to come under a lot more pressure from demanding sources, from building roads, houses, water courses, wind farms, and so on. So our land base is going to come under more and more pressure under these sorts of systems. So we have to manage it in a much more effective way, which is not just about growth potential, but about sustaining the land-based resource under these multiple demands on which it's going to face.
Okay, thank you. And here at the very end, we sort of come back to the first question again. Somebody just came in and said, I mean, are we actually pushing ahead fast enough? I mean, sort of timescales, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Are we getting the public to understand that there is a really urgent crisis and that we should do something about it earlier? And are we getting the public support in that sense? And that is also linked with another question talked about, I mean, should it be made mandatory within the European Union, or should sort of individual countries voluntarily decide whether they want to move ahead or not? And I just wonder whether at the very end here now, we could ask Karina just to say a few words about it. We are really out of time, so just a very short comment. Karina, if you will, please.
A short comment on whether we are on time with change.
Yeah, I mean, are we actually ambitious enough? I mean, if we are not sort of saying really things are urgent now, are we just sort of letting things slide, as it were? Whereas the climate change people are kind of more aggressive, and they have pushed things up high up on the agenda of governments.
Well, I hope we are. For sure, we have been rather ambitious, I think, in synthesizing the scientific data that shows that we have to act quickly. But then we have the problem of how you actually act quickly and in systems where people may also have different understandings and assumptions of who should act and what is enough. I mean, I received some questions. Someone asked, for instance, the farm to fork strategy seems to focus a lot on consumer responsibility. Some people may have, we have provided our advice, but they may also think about how they act in relation to what is possible for them to do. That's all I can mention on that. I also received some other questions on which are about, farm to fork and what can be done, and member states are so diverse, can we actually have effective EU policies? I think this is sort of the same question that Ole posed, and I think all we can do is act now as much as we can. EU policies may not go the full way, different countries will have to work, but EU policies can set something on the agenda, hopefully. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are coming to the end of this webinar, and first of all, I want to thank all our speakers for giving interesting presentations and being willing to engage in the discussion. We could obviously have continued much, much longer as always, but there we are. Finally, I want to thank those who have made this possible, SAPEA, and particularly the Academia Europaea Cardiff Knowledge Hub, led by Louis Edwards, and particularly acknowledge the major work done by Julia Davis in getting this going. We're also very grateful to Cardiff University Sustainable Place Research Institute and to the EU Green Week. And finally, as Karina already mentioned, there is another webinar organized by SAPEA next week, actually. Karina is also going to participate in that one on the 22nd of October on the EU's role. So please don't forget about that webinar. It will undoubtedly also be a very exciting occasion. So thank you very much to all of you, and also to all of those who sent in very good questions, and apologies to those whose questions were not answered, but as always in these matters, we run out of time. So this webinar is now closed. Thank you very much indeed.